Thank you so much. We've had a great discussion in this first session of our workshop. Let's move on to session number 2. Thank you, everybody. Jeannie, please.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And we've just opened up a lot of topics for this, Cynthia and Enrique. And I just received word that Mark Watts, who is going to join us, is on London time and thought that the meeting, he's coming in at 10 o'clock as opposed to 9 o'clock our time. So he will be joining this panel, which we are.
Well, hello again, everybody. Thank you so much for joining now session number 3. After a great discussion on session number 1 and number 2. Session 3 is titled Financing Adaptation, Public Utilities and Services in Urban Areas. And we have a fantastic group of panelists. We have with us David Dolman, who's the lead author of chapter 6 of the IPCC report. And he's also director of human settlements at the International Institute for Environment and Development. We have Tatiana Gallego, who's the chief from the Housing and Urban Development Climate Change sector at the Inter-American Development Bank. And we have also with us Elizabeth Yee, who's the executive vice president, the program strategy and chief of staff at the Rockefeller Foundation. And to moderate this session, let me introduce you Matthias Bau. He's a professor of practice at the Department of Landscape Architecture at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. Please, Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mauricio, and it's good to see you all, and it's good to see you, Tatiana, Liz, and David. So today we're going to be talking about the financing of adaptation of public utilities and services in urban areas. And which is a huge challenge, and because there's a lot that needs to change in order to be able to adapt to a changing climate, and all that needs to happen at the same time that we're also mitigating the climate crisis. And today we have 3 fantastic speakers who will each give us a short sort of statement or initial presentation. After which we will have a conversation. I have a number of questions to ask, but I would love it if people contribute their questions to the chat. For today, we will start with David Dolman, who, as Mauricio said, is the lead author of the chapter 6 of the IPCC 6th assessment report. And he's also the director of the Human Settlements Group at the International Institute for the Environment and Development, and a senior teaching fellow in the Development Planning Unit at University College in London. Prior to his appointment as director there, Dr. Dolman obtained his doctorate in geography from the University of Oxford and served as a lecturer in human geography at the universities of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica. And as an expert on climate change vulnerability and resilience in urban centers, he has contributed to major international reports, including UN Habitat's Global Report on Human Settlements, and as said most recently as the coordinating lead on cities, settlements, and key infrastructure for the IPCC 6th assessment report. And his current work focuses on the understanding of the nature of urban risks and the way in which these hazards can be mitigated. So I would like to now give the floor to Dr. Dolman before introducing the others and then having a conversation. David.
Great, thanks very much, Matthias. Can I just get a thumbs up or a nod that you can hear and see me adequately? Great, thanks very much. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you, even though it's a shame that we're not able to see each other in person. And thanks for the introduction. I mean, I like the way you said prior to this was doing a PhD. Makes it sound like it was only a couple of years ago, which would be nice when it's more years than one might choose to acknowledge. What I thought I would share in my opening comments was some of the way in which infrastructure has been treated in the most recent IPCC report, recognizing that there's a specific chapter on cities, settlements, and key infrastructure. And I think one of the starting points for this was a recognition that there are really two sides to this. Firstly, that there are infrastructures that are essential for cities to function properly and to meet the needs of residents. And therefore, these infrastructures themselves need to be adapted to cope with the challenges from climate change. But secondly, that infrastructure is a critical, infrastructures of various kinds are critical intermediaries that facilitate the resilience of individuals, households, economic sectors within the city. So the infrastructures themselves need to be made more resilient, and infrastructure plays a critical role in making all of the other components of urban functioning more resilient. And what we did, the way we tackled this challenge in drafting this chapter in the IPCC report was to interpret infrastructure fairly broadly. So we interpreted infrastructure as covering physical infrastructure, the drains, the roads, the seawalls, the physical built environment of infrastructure. But we interpreted it more broadly to also include social infrastructure and natural infrastructure. And the conclusion that we came to, which I think is strongly vindicated by most of both the academic, the conceptual work, and the practical work that people have done over recent years, is that all of these are necessary. None on their own is sufficient. And it's the ways in which the physical built environment, the social and the natural come together, which are critical in creating resilience in cities. So the physical infrastructure covers itself a broad range, everything from community scale drainage systems, the physical infrastructure, the built environment around housing and how housing is constructed, all the way up to large scale trunk infrastructure. And of course, the way in which these are financed will vary greatly depending on the type of physical infrastructure that we're dealing with. And one of the things that I think we recognize is that at the neighborhood scale, particularly in the low and middle income countries, which is where I spend most of my working life, there's a great potential for innovative financial mechanisms, including using community saving schemes as a basis for seeding or co-enabling infrastructure at the community or neighborhood scale. Whereas, of course, if you're talking about citywide drainage systems, trunk infrastructure, and then you have a very different set of questions to ask around the financing. And the social infrastructure, I think one of the things that's most, trying to be fairly brief and highlight the things which perhaps are the most interesting at the moment, is the interest in adaptive social protection in urban areas. And we've got good experience of social protection and adaptive social protection in rural settings, particularly around agricultural livelihoods. Good experience on social protection in urban settings, cash transfers, conditional cash transfers, benefits of various forms, but not linking this to climate change, and not really thinking about how we would need to change the way in which social protection schemes as a form of social infrastructure could be implemented and financed to build resilience, particularly for the lowest income groups in cities. And then thirdly, the natural infrastructure, the real much stronger body of practice and of evidence, of the ways in which nature-based solutions can play a critical role, including in dense urban settlements around a range of climate hazards, particularly coastal protection and particularly in temperature regulation through parks, green spaces and tree planting. What I'd like to comment on though with the nature-based solutions, maybe two things. Firstly, that this remains contentious among many national governments, that the acceptance of nature-based solutions as being an established part of the techniques that can be legitimately recognized for climate adaptation is less widespread than we might like. And what happens in the government plenaries for IPCC is meant to be treated reasonably confidentially, but I don't think it's a great secret that several of the governments had major problems with the term nature-based solutions. But secondly, that nature-based solutions in themselves are neither inherently good nor inherently bad. They are part of a set of tools and strategies and infrastructures that can contribute to urban resilience, but they're subject to the same issues around power relations and inclusion as any other form of infrastructural development. And I think there's a particular need to recognize the ways in which nature-based solutions have the potential to be have perverse outcomes around displacing some of the very people who they're most meant to help, or around increasing the cost of land, which reduces affordability in the city for some of the lowest income groups who need to be made more resilient as well. So I think I'll stop there in terms of opening comments by framing those three forms of infrastructures, and then presumably we'll come back to different ways of talking about what the financing might be for these infrastructures, or what some of the challenges might be in their implementation.
Thank you very much, David. This is a great start, and I really like how in this initial statement you said there are sort of the two types of infrastructure, right? The ones that need to be made resilient, but also the infrastructure that is a condition for resilience, and I think that distinction I think is really helpful. I'd like to now introduce Tatiana Gallego-Lizon, who is the Chief of Housing and Urban Development of the Climate Change sector at the Inter-American Development Bank. She's an urbanist and engineer with over 20 years of experience in international development, and her interests include urban climate change resilience and biodiversity, integrated water resources, regional and urban planning, and governance with a focus, and you'll hear that, on innovative approaches and forms. And so currently, Dr. Gallego serves as the Division Chief for Housing and Urban Development at IADB, already said that. And before this, she worked at the Asian Development Bank, where she held various positions, including the Director of Urban Development and Water Division of the Southeast Asian Department, where she pioneered agendas on urban climate change resilience across border economic zones and corridor town development. She holds a PhD and then a Master's in Engineering in Environmental Engineering from Imperial College in London, and a PhD in Policy Studies from the School of African and Oriental Studies. Dr. Gallego, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Matthijs. Thank you very much. And, following, David's beautiful, framework of, how to approach, if you want, adaptation, as it's captured in its most, in the IPCC's most recent report, I thought I would throw in a few numbers just to be, if not aware, at least, put in context, what, climate change and adaptation resources, are necessary. But maybe before, we put numbers for, climate, adaptation, infrastructure, and public services, as a few agencies have projected them to be, I thought it would be helpful to realize that, climate change is already, causing a tremendous burden when it comes to, not just, health problems, but also economic and social costs, let alone all the natural, context, which, very often is not properly valued. In terms of, economic and natural disasters worldwide in 2021, there is estimates that indicate that they alone cost almost 350 billion. And although insurance is there, most part of the time is, in most developed economies, and, it barely reach 130 billion. it depends, on which, reinsurer you're talking to. I mean, but they're roughly around that number. For countries like Latin America and for regions like Latin America and the Caribbean, where I work most extensively, natural disasters are also, increasing in intensity, in number. And, just put in context, OCHA estimated that, in 20 years, there was more than 1,200 disasters that affected the region. They affected more than 40 million people. And, they caused, by those bases, about $27 billion just for floods, which only make a third of the total number. Obviously, if you read, there's also an incredible impact on business disruptions, which, we'll talk, if you want, a little bit about the private sector in a minute. But again, just to throw a few numbers, there's a global supply chain report for 2021 that indicates that, the cost of environmental risks like, climate change, deforestation, and water insecurity are well over 1 trillion. As estimated by suppliers. Morgan Stanley, had thrown a number of more than 50 trillion at some point as well. So this is what is already costing. Now, in terms of, projections of how much should be invested, the CCFLA 2015 report estimated that around $93 trillion would be required to actually, provide, climate enhancement, to provide the infrastructure needs that were, necessary. And of that, in between 10 and 25% would be required for climate enhancement. And that, almost 70% of the total amount needed to go to urban areas, which makes approximately $15 trillion. UNEP's adaptation gap report of last year, if I remember correctly, estimates that for adaptation alone, the cost would be in between 150 and 330 billion by 2030. So I think the numbers are, mind-boggling. How much is actually, going in is very limited. We're talking about, over the last decade, I think it's about 600 billion, in 2019 to 2020. And for adaptation, even though we're seeing a small increase, it has barely reached 46 billion. So we're still really far away. Most of the adaptation finance is coming from the public sector at the moment, even though, we need both public and private actors to come into it. There's several problems. There's, information, gaps. There is limitation, in how this finance is tracked. There is also, difficulties, in bringing this, if you want, to the emerging and developing economies. And in addition to that, there is also, certain decisions which are critical and multi-sectoral that need to be, treated in ways differently to, which are different to the traditional project, sectoral approach that we use, like land use, buildings, and also, having, that whole of government approach for coordinating, and monitoring commitments. I'll make a pause there. But my point, was that, we're still really far away from, reaching the investment that we need, both, from public and from private actors, and the cities, have to play a central role when it comes to, leading this agenda. Thanks, Mattis. And sorry, I spoke a bit more than I wanted.
I'm glad you did. Thank you. Thank you, Tatiana. I mean, if I make quick calculations, the good news, and I think that is sort of confirmed in a number we often hear, is that for every dollar spent on adaptation or prevention, we actually save quite more than $1, maybe even $4 to $6 in avoided cost. And if I hear your numbers, even though they're big, a quick calculation says from that perspective it should be possible. But I understand the challenges with the uncertainty and the complexity of these challenges. I would like to now go to Elizabeth Yee, who is the Executive Vice President for Program Strategy and the Chief of Staff at the Rockefeller Foundation, where she oversees the foundation's portfolio of global programs and leads the advancements of the foundation's strategic priority. She joined the Rockefeller Foundation in 2019 as Managing Director for Climate and Resilience, in part, I think, because the fantastic work she did at 100 Resilient Cities from 2050, which was a project sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, where she held various leadership roles, including Vice President for Strategic Partnerships, City Solutions, and for Resilience Finance. Before that, she co-led the public power and utilities practice of Barclays Capital, and so she's been doing a lot of work in financial markets at Morgan Stanley, Lehman Brothers, and Barclays. So I am really happy to see you again, Liz, and also to see you here as a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, but also because your incredible experience on this topic. So thank you for joining us.
Matthijs, it's been too long. It's really, really nice to see you. And I'm really glad Mauricio asked that I join. So thanks, Mauricio, for including me in this discussion. It's really nice to meet you, Tatiana and David, and hear about the work that you all are doing. I thought that I was best suited to talk about some of the private sector financing work that I've done and that we've been really thinking about at the foundation on how we can help accelerate the private sector financing towards urban adaptation and build on the remarks you made, Tatiana. And I won't belabor some of the statistics because I feel like Tatiana covered so many of them. But I think some of the challenges that we saw at 100 RC were just really around the ability that private sector is obviously moving into mitigation, because we are able to quantifiably talk about the benefit, talk about how much carbon we're taking out, value that, finance it. But adaptation, it's so critically important. The challenge has really been, and obviously it does add significant economic and social value that David also mentioned. But I think the challenge in terms of mobilizing private sector finance has been around the ability to really understand the losses and also addressing the costs. And one of the things that I think I was very struck by at 100 RC was just adapting infrastructure so that it is more resilient to climate shocks can add up to 3% of upfront costs and increase the initial investment by 400%. Now that doesn't mean you can't recapitalize that after the infrastructure is in place, but getting people to buy into that up front makes it a little bit more difficult. And so I just thought I'd share a little bit about some of the things that we've done at RF and that we did at 100 Resilient Cities to help accelerate investment and adaptation, and really talk from my old life about some of the challenges and things that I think we think about as we figure out how to make these investments in ways that in ways that we need to address as a community focused on urban adaptation finance in order to mobilize private sector capital. And I think one of the things I think we saw coming out of COP was a number of private sector investors eager to engage. Tatiana mentioned that the development finance institutions, governments, and philanthropies have always been eager to do this, but now we see the private sector and the group that Mark Carney brought to bear, the GFANS group, made a commitment of $130 trillion to net zero. So my theory on that is let's figure out how to get that to come to some of the projects that we need to be part of and we really need to happen in order to protect our communities. And I see several things that we need to do in order to make that money flow. So first is really thinking about how we develop financial solutions at scale. that the private sector can understand. Small transactions won't get them there, and they need to be aggregated and packaged. So thinking about things at scale, and thinking about how we aligned market convention to ensure liquidity, because investors, private sector investors, really only want to move where there's liquidity and they're able to trade out and in of positions in secondary markets. I think third is really thinking about risk and return, and what that looks like. And that's where I think we as RF have really been trying to help to deploy our philanthropic capital as first loss to make a transaction come to fruition. And then really working in partnering with the private sector to design and develop those solutions to make it happen. So a couple solutions, because I know, Mauricio, you said talk about solutions. So here's some of the things that we've done. First is the inherent challenge around project development, pre-feasibility and design. And I think that's something we've seen the world over. So one of the things that we've tried is we've built a fund in partnership with Meridium and UN Capital Development Fund called the TURF. It's the Urban Resilience Fund. And that is really focused on funding critical resilience infrastructure projects in Europe and Africa. And it provides cities in non-OECD and OECD countries the ability to access technical financial support to design and develop those projects. And right now, TURF has raised about 290 million euro of committed capital. It's got a catalytic tranche really helping support capacity building for municipalities, and then another tranche really focused on implementing those projects. And it has a resilience screen that it uses to help identify, review, and improve the resilience of projects before it invests. A second example that I wanted to share was the very first publicly offered environmental impact bond that we helped support and develop for the city of Atlanta in Georgia. And that was in 2019 as part of 100 Resilient Cities. And the city was really looking at stormwater as a critical resilience challenge. And so this was a way to enable the city to finance green infrastructure, to improve its stormwater management capacity, do it as a public transaction, so regular way investors could actually participate in the offering. And in so doing, enable the city, once the projects are fully built in 2024, to reduce its stormwater runoff by 55 million gallons. And so the key thing here is that it was issued on an existing lien of the city. So it wasn't bespoke, and it was a bit, it tapped into the ability of investors to have that liquidity in the secondary market. And then the last thing, because I think I just wanted to share this one because I think it tied up very much to what David and Tatiana were talking about in terms of nature-based solutions. We worked with the Nature Conservancy, the National Parks Commission, Swiss Re, and others to put in place a reef insurance policy for Mexico to preserve the reef and ensure that payouts would occur and be triggered when storm force winds actually hit a certain speed. So it was more like an insurance for nature plan. I saw someone wrote a comment on insurance, and I think it can also be a really interesting opportunity to be able to capitalize and enable private sector investment into adaptation. And so I think those are some of the things that we've done. We continue to invest, as Tatiana mentioned, in data, and we've been supporting the Lacuna Fund, which is the first collaborative effort to provide data scientists, research, and social entrepreneurs in low and middle income countries the ability to produce labeled data sets so that we can use that to enable private sector and other finance to flow, because if you can't measure it, you can't finance it. And then second, we're really working at the local and state and federal level to ensure that we have government policies and incentives in place to accelerate action and identify opportunities. And also in some instances, support local municipalities in developing markets to be able to have their own credit ratings and financial autonomy so that they can access the financial markets independent of national governments. So those are some of the lessons that we've learned, some of the solutions that we've been supporting in terms of urban climate adaptation. And I'll turn it back to you, Matthijs, but I'm really excited to learn from this group today on some of the other things that are out there.
Thank you, Liz, and so much to unpack here. So to me, the task to make that into some sensible questions. One of the things that interests me and that in many ways you've all talked about is one of the challenges is to involve the market sector in financing. And that's something that we come across a lot, and I'm really happy, Liz, that you showed some examples of where this is possible. But from my experience, one of the reasons that the market has so much difficulty in financing adaptation has to do with managing uncertainty, right? We don't know what a future climate will be. We know some bandwidth, but there's a lot of uncertainty. There's uncertainty surrounding the types of solutions that we are using, specifically when you start to use nature-based solutions, but also with other types of infrastructures, because we're dealing with complex systems with a strong sort of social components. Could you, and maybe each of you, talk a bit more about this role that uncertainty vis-a-vis the climate crisis and the scope of the climate crisis plays in your particular field, and how you're trying to sort of manage that uncertainty? And maybe I can just start with Tatjana here, because she is the one who was most explicit about the topic of uncertainty.
Oh, Matisse, not perfect. I belong to the sovereign, or if you want, to the public sector side of the Inter-American Development Bank. So in many ways, and I'll talk a little bit about private sector, but I think Liz, just hit it nail on. So I'll leave it to her. On our side, I have to say that, there is a lot of things that from the public sector we can help do to actually support, uncertainty. So on the one hand, I think, there is already a lot of uncertainty that surrounds projections, that surrounds, climate events, possible outcomes, probabilities. But there is also uncertainties that, come with financing, cities, which, might be, affected by, fiscal inability to repay, et cetera, et cetera. At IDB, we have, like, many of the other development finance institutions, there is, sovereign windows that might allow for minimum risk. And much of the adaptation infrastructure finance that happens already, it's financed through the sovereign windows. That can be through a national program, through a national ministry, through a financial intermediary like a national bank, and that limits the amount of risk that is perceived by investors worldwide in recovering some of the funds. Having said that, I think that it's insufficient. And I think to a large extent, it leaves a lot of, the cities out. Therefore, I think, we need to, find ways to cope with, financial uncertainty, but still reach the cities. I think subnational lending is a very important, and subnational debt is a very important way of enabling cities, not only to take on their responsibilities, but also to allow them to lead, and choose the options that they find most appropriate together with their citizens, and are able to, to design and basically work on their projects on this basis. I think that, subnational lending needs to be accompanied, since it wouldn't actually, have, all those, guarantees that come with sovereign lending, needs to actually also identify de-risking instruments. And I think, this is something that is important when it comes to moving forward and, scaling up subnational financing. But at the same time, from the public sector, I think, we can, and we do already, but, maybe even more, we need to help cities, improve their credit ratings, their financials, and their fiscal management. We need to help cities create, their own portfolio of climate projects, both in mitigation and in adaptation fronts. I think there is also, an important contribution to, building competencies, generating these portfolios of bankable projects. And I think, creating innovative financing strategies for these cities to be able to take on, additional burden and be able also through other instruments capture future capital gains. The more ready they are, the more independent they will become. And, maybe, through other instruments such as, green, sustainable, and one day resilient bonds, I think, we might see, a greater contribution from their side. I'll make a pause there. I could go on to private sector again. I think Lise, is heated on really well. And I think, she's probably, she's had great examples.
Who wants to follow up on that? David.
David,
Liz, go ahead. Please go. Yeah. Liz.
Okay. I'll take a run at it.
Yeah.
Tatiana, thanks. And I guess one of the, well, you made many good points. The one that I just really, I really wanted to put even more of a bright highlighter on was this idea of city credit ratings, because I just feel like that, we are so lucky in the United States to be able to have a robust sub-sovereign market where cities have the autonomy and ability to raise capital and get projects done that they need to get done. And we can certainly have a long debate about the efficacy of that market, but at least that mechanism exists. I think that's one of the things that we've, that I think really needs to happen in order to help accelerate some of these projects. I know that I see Michael Berkowitz on the line, and I know that was something that we very much talked about and tried to work on at 100 Resilient Cities as well. And I guess I just, yes, exactly. But I guess the other thing that I think we've been trying to do at RF as well is really think about how we can use our philanthropic capital to accelerate the project development cycle, or at least maybe even the ideation and project development cycle. And then also really think about how we can be that first loss capital in the capital stack to enable private sector investment to come in, or to homogenize a credit so that we can actually bundle and package a number of transactions together, recognizing that the value of the transactions independently would be very hard for private sector to engage. But if we can be that first loss capital, we can help make more things happen. Nice to see you, Michael.
David.
So I mean, it feels appropriate for me to not have interrupted those two, because I think I'm going to come from a slightly different angle, and I'd like to comment first on the physical uncertainty, and then secondly on the financial uncertainty. I think we are in a position where some of the physical uncertainty around the nature and extent of climate change within cities and the impacts within cities is reducing. I think for the first time, the IPCC Working Group 1, which is the physical science basis, included substantial sections of analysis on urban climate impact. This is the first time that they've done that. And that's because the evidence they're able to draw on in terms of the GCMs and the downscaling of them has got more and more precise, and they're able to make more and more clear suggestions about the extent of warming, the extent of precipitation intensity, and the various things. So there's a narrowing down of some of the physical uncertainty, which I think begins to reduce some of what we have to engage with when we're talking with people who are operating at a city scale as to the level of uncertainty that they will face. So I mean, that's a physical, the physical uncertainty, which deserves a lot more attention, but is narrowing down, at least to an extent. On the issues of the financial uncertainty, I will be only slightly provocative and say that when we come right down to the neighborhood and the household level, people have dealt, and particularly in the lowest income neighborhoods, including informal settlements, uncertainty is something which has always been managed. The uncertainty as to whether a house is going to be bulldozed tomorrow and whether one invests in upgrading the quality of the dwelling when it's on land which is not formally recognized, doesn't have formal tenure, and is at risk of being bulldozed tomorrow. The uncertainty of livelihoods that are in the informal sector. I mean, we know that even formal employment is precarious, but in the informal in the formal economy, it's even more precarious. So in a sense, when we're dealing at the household and community level, there is a lot of experience in dealing with uncertainty and in managing uncertainty. But at the same time, there's a lot of certainty. And the certainty there is that the fundamentals of building resilience and resilient infrastructure for the lowest income groups revolves around the access to safe and affordable land and the provision of basic services. And there is a fair amount of certainty as to what safe and affordable land looks like and costs, and what basic services that reduce risk looks like as well. And so I think and there's also a fair amount of experience about how funds of different kinds can be managed to achieve some of these basic elements of resilience. They're not neglecting the fact that future changes in climate will require new investments and new forms of investment, but the basic roots of resilience around land and basic service provision are well understood. And we have a wealth of experience in the way that blending of funds, for example, bringing together municipal budgets, national budgets, grant financing, and community savings groups, for example, can come together in ways that do facilitate people, some of the most vulnerable people, to have access to land and basic services in a way that creates the basis for resilience. So I suppose, if this does add to the conversation so far, I see it as calling for the willingness of different forms of capital finance to blend and mix with other sorts of finance, willingness to devolve at least some elements of decision making, particularly around investments in land and basic service provision, and willingness to devolve to think about accountability going in both directions, fiscal accountability to where funds come from, but also accountability to the intended beneficiaries. And so I think the discussion around subnational finance and subnational lending is a very important one. I think my immediate concern is that the more intermediaries, the greater the losses and the dribbling away of funds as they go. And so thinking about more direct accountability as well.
I think that's a really good point. And in your introduction, you talked a bit about how we need to look at infrastructure in a sort of broad sense, right? And include in that the sort of social infrastructure. And when we talk about multiple benefits, when we talk about blended finance, when we talk about projects, for instance, like the project that Liz described in Atlanta with the environmental impact bonds, which is based not only on stormwater capture, but also on a host of other benefits. We are dealing with very sort of complex problems, right? And I really enjoy the fact or applaud the fact that you say so clearly that this social component, the management of different interest groups and stakeholders, and creating the capacity with different interest groups and stakeholders is so important in order to engage the complexity of these questions. Could someone reflect a bit more on that particular topic, and also come maybe with some other good examples of where that has worked? David, you're still, yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, Matthijs. I was so your question is where the devolution of responsibilities at the community level or at the
I think
citizen level?
I think at many levels is how do you deal with the social complexities of sort of packaging the financing that is necessary to create this new resilience and resilient infrastructure?
Maybe, just very briefly from my side, I think, as, from especially when dealing with disaster risk management, at most DFI levels, I think there is a very strong structure that, I mean, the framework is a little different to the one that that Matisse presented, but that David presented. But I think, very strongly when it comes to disaster risk management, which, is not far related to adaptation, since, they have so many connections, there is typically three elements that come into discussion. One is the institutional capability for managing, and here I think is where, if you want, the state, comes into, taking certain responsibilities. The second one is the financial provisions, and there, for instance, examples like the one that Liz provided on whether there is insurance, whether there is, ability to, trigger cash transfers, etc. It's also central. And the third one, which is extremely important, is the social, if you want, component. And there, I think, working, through communities, with communities, not only in, learning, from, the traditional knowledge of the land, the traditional knowledge of the setup, but also, understanding what is the actual social and community, network that will be able to be transformative is totally critical. We do work a lot, especially in informal settlements, as David mentioned, and there's one excellent example which I'm just throwing it again. It's been done through the city of Buenos Aires with a focus on transforming. It's called Barrio 31, neighborhood number 31, which before, was Villa 31, which was Slum 31. So, the transformative action was both economical, social, physical, and environmental. And, the component of, providing, community support, community networks, reduce insecurity, support to vulnerable groups, which can be, single mothers, it can be, disabilities, and creating, a structure that is able to react in the face of adversity is actually essential in areas which, which are particularly exposed to climate change events. We've done a lot of work. I mentioned Barrio 31, but a lot of favelas in Brazil are exposed to landslide. In Peru, we do a lot of work in areas which are suffering from flash floods in river areas. And working through the community and social component is essential for identifying points of danger, identifying solutions, and especially making them sustainable.
Thank you, Tatiana. Please, is this Sheila Patel? Please take the floor. Thank you.
I just want to give you two very powerful experiences from STI, where with the transformation of the architecture of who participates in producing a macro solution that has social justice, and that it's possible, is what I'm going to talk to you. The city of Mumbai had to improve its local train transport in order to ensure that the 95% of public transport episodes were maintained. 95% of people used public transport. And for the last 40 years, there was no improvement. So the government took a huge loan of, I think, $7 to $100 million from the World Bank. And because we as a national network had a federation of 150,000 households who live along the railway track within 5 to 80 feet from the track, we designed an alternative solution that would constitute 10% of the total cost of the project to rehouse these people, which would be the only way in which this project could have been done. This project has been hanging for 14 years before we got involved. And we designed a relocation policy. We developed a role and a function for the federations to get $1 million to design and explore relocation. We find that the World Bank, which financed this, which celebrates innovation, even today does not publicly announce this innovation. However, through STI, we have supported federations in Kenya and 2 other countries to do similar negotiations with the privatization of their railway things, which are big mitigation projects, but which produce huge impacts on poor communities who live illegally in that vicinity. And so what was said earlier about how mitigation projects produce huge requirements to explore adaptation solutions is there. So I feel that in all the conversations all of you have, you are not factoring the reality that unless poor people's organizations are available, have voices, have capacities, you produce solutions that push them out, but not necessarily improve the quality of their lives. And I don't think there's enough research, enough action being done on this. Similarly, David and others have documented the special SPA that STI did in Kenya for the largest informal settlement, which transformed the manner in which these large townships, which are like European towns, could reorganize their planning systems on the basis of what communities needed, with the potential of incrementally bringing in climatically sensitive alternatives for energy and transport and other things. I do not find a single financing institution giving us resources to do this in even 5 more cities. We don't find enough organizations that want to work there. Everybody wants to work in medium and small towns and not touch the large cities. And so that's a challenge for all of us here to say that we all accept very casually and very passionately that these are all long-term solutions. But organizing communities, giving them voices for these 40 to 45% of the city's population, a right to participate in these solutions. Big financial projects trample over people. In 90% of all the gold star projects, you go 3 years later and those communities are in deep distress because we don't look at what happens to them after they have been moved. So I'm just, so this whole thing of feeling accountable to the bottom vulnerable communities, both from a social justice angle, but also from a planetary situation. If people who are poor in slums are treated like this is how we are treating the LDCs. We are treating the least, all these vulnerable countries. So I feel that the politics of how these choices are made and what legitimates them is not seriously discussed in our discussions. Sorry, I'm finished.
No, thank you for this. I think this is really valuable, and in my experience also involving the communities and in a very active way, in the end also creates better and more durable plans. But the institutional challenges of doing that and bringing that into into the financial world are used. Do any of the panelists or anyone else here have a thought about how that can be strengthened? Before I go to David Jackson, but maybe David is the one who also has a thought on this particular topic. I see you raise your hand.
I'll be brief, and I'm sure others will come in as well. I mean, the sorts of examples that we come up with around municipal funds. There's examples of them in Uganda, for example, where the finance is putting jointly from municipalities, from an international development donor, and from community funds for neighbourhood and citywide upgrading projects, and where the decision making around the spending of those funds has to be the mechanism for deciding how the funds are used involves a joint decision making process between organised communities and municipalities the municipalities. And of course, this draws on a richer history of participatory budgeting. And I think one of the things which I often reflect on is that while we are talking about a specific challenge relating to the impacts of climate change, many of the issues around how urban development, particularly that meets the needs of low-income groups, is done, are challenges that have been faced before. And I think we need to look back to some of these other initiatives, what we can learn from them about the decision-making processes, about the financial inputs, and about the potential and the limits for these processes. I mean, there's a wide variety of inputs that come in as well. I mean, there are initiatives funded by the Asian Development Bank, as well as ones that are driven by community groups as to how the labour of people living in communities can be incorporated as a meaningful aspect of the overall economic cost of upgrading projects, for example. And so doing a meaningful accounting of these different forms of value also makes a difference.
Thank you, David. Liz.
Sure. Sheila, it's an honor to have you here, and I'm so glad you raised that, because I do appreciate your comments specifically on making sure that we include all aspects of our population, from large cities to small, from wealthy individuals to those who have less resources. And I mean, this is not a mitigation solution per se, but I think one of the things that we've been very focused on is exactly that, and really looking both at urban scale and rural. So I know, Matthias, I'm going way out of bounds here, but I think one of the things I just wanted to share on that note was the work that we're doing in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we're working in 21 cities to really try to bring electricity through metro scale grids to vulnerable populations who will otherwise not have that chance to be able to be part of, to be able to even have an opportunity to join the modern economy absent electricity. And I think you're exactly right. I think one of the things that we've been learning through our work here, and then in our work in India and in terms of electrification, is the real need to provide community support on the demand side, because this is a new resource that these communities have not had access to, stable power, in some instances power, electricity in general. And we've really been working with those communities, women and girls in particular, who are most impacted by climate change, to help figure out how we can support them and help them build livelihoods. So I do think that that's I agree with you that it needs to be more front and center in the work that we all do around climate change and adaptation in particular.
Thank you, Liz. I have a raised hand from David Jackson.
Thank you very much indeed. I think this is a really good question, and it's a really good discussion. And perhaps, as always, the answer is in the detail. And I think one of the issues in the broader financing for development agenda is that in 2015, there's the Addis Ababa financing for development agenda, which was quite broad and contextualized. but then it became kind of either captured or reduced to a couple of lowest common denominators, and you lost all of that that texture in terms of the way that the finance needs to be structured. And I think it's very important, it's even more critically important that we don't have the same thing with private finance, and in particular with, with climate finance, and in particular with adaptation finance. So, I mean, on mitigation finance, you know, there's a whole lot we can say, the way that works or hasn't worked. But when it comes to adaptation finance and the topic of this particular meeting, you know, it's the bankable project is not the answer to the world's urban climate adaptation problems. It never will be. And I think we heard a little bit about that at the beginning from Jeffrey Sachs, but I think we need to understand that it's part of the answer. And a lot of it depends on the structure of the finance that is created and the problem that is trying to be solved in a particular city. You know, Liz mentioned the International Municipal Investment Fund, an Urban Resilience Fund, the TURF. So we've been involved in that. That will provide type of solution for certain types of infrastructure which require that kind of large finance on a project finance basis. And one of the ways in which that will mitigate against potential harm and be able to do what it's going to do is it takes a long-term equity position. So it kind of owns and manages the risk over many, many years, even 20, 30 years. So it's not like lending, it's not debt, it's an equity, and you can manage that risk over time. But that also has problems built into it, of course, because then in order to manage that risk, as Sheila said, you know, if you're not careful, people will get pushed out of the way. But I think what I liked about David's description of infrastructure is, you know, the breadth and depth of what constitutes infrastructure. And for a lot of that, and for a lot of adaptation, it's not going to be project finance, I'm afraid. It's going to be different types of public finance, or different way, and slightly better targeted. And there can be forms of blending, but I think it's different types of blending. You know, we talk about bringing the private sector in. One way to bring them in is for them to pay a levy, a fee, a tariff, if whatever you want to call it, for the public de-risking that's going to take place to enable the city to remain solvent and to enable them to continue to make their money. So, and I think that this risk reduction, the risk reduction of the public investment, which is performing a function for the private sector, needs to be built into the business models. And it's not only about land value capture, which has been raised many times. In developing countries, that's very difficult to manage. There has to be other elements that we can address, perhaps through that kind of rejigging the taxation, the fee structure. Another one, as we discussed earlier, is this top-up financing for those, and this is what I think is critical to the issues that Sheila's talking about in terms of informal settlements. What it needs the incremental cost of that informal settlement making itself resilient needs to be funded. And if you fund that incremental cost, it can do it very well. We've seen in various parts of the world, there are some great examples in Latin America of how informal settlements have been able to make themselves resilient. It needs fungible, holistic financing for making that informal settlement resilient, but delivered by the same entities, the sanitation, the infrastructure people, the public works people, all of the NGOs, the people that are already there. You know, you don't need a new structure to do it. And if you do that and you do make it more resilient, the local fiscal space will increase. And there is evidence of that. I mean, there is evidence of where you make those investments, the fiscal space increases, the tax base increases, property values also increase, you can get the money back. That needs to be calculated in. So I think we need to think, we mustn't make the same mistake that's happening in the financing for development and just reducing it down to, well, there's not enough money, bring the private sector in, let's build some projects. It's far more complex than that. And I think we just need to understand that breadth of complexity.
Any reflections on what David just brought to the table? And I think this issue of liquidity, I think is there as well, right? Like how do you create, maybe through levies, similarly to insurance and rates and banking on sort of normal city functions? How can you use that to create these sort of hybrid financing models? David Dotman.
Thanks. And to come on to some bits of what the the other David was saying. I mean, I think the point on the incremental costs is very important, because I think one thing we are conscious of is that climate finance is allocated to addressing the costs associated with climate change. Yet we're also very aware that if we're putting in place infrastructure now that is not climate resilient, that it's pouring money down the, probably quite down the literal drain, if we're talking about some forms of risk reducing infrastructure. So we're wasting money if we don't do it in a climate resilient way, but we need to recognize that there may well be an increment which is associated with climate resilience. And so financing mechanisms that recognize maybe some of the addressing of the infrastructure gap or the development gap in cities needs to be met by non-climate funds, but there needs to be the ability to use climate financing to meet that incremental cost, and that's actually saving a considerable amount in the long run. The other thing though that I want to comment on coming from that is the increasing recognition of climate resilient development as an outcome, which goes beyond thinking about just adaptation or just mitigation or just sustainable development, and recognizes that what we're aiming for is outcomes that bring those things together. And I think that is highly relevant in a range of settings as well. And to keep the examples from the low and middle income countries where I work, if we're thinking about how to make low income neighborhoods more resilient, we need to be thinking about their location and the implications of the location for lock-in of path dependencies around transport, and particularly high carbon transport. We need to be thinking about their connectivity to grids and what that means for lower carbon or net zero futures for these settlements as well. And so I think we can talk easily, and I think the comment was made earlier about the relative ease of financing mitigation because of the ease of measuring the benefits. I think if we're looking at how the things tie together, that's also got to be a frontier. How do we get energy for low income groups, which makes them more resilient because it increases productivity, it enables livelihoods, it facilitates education, but also doing that in a way which is conducive towards a net zero future. How do we identify land for low income residents, which is safe and affordable, but is also accessible and doesn't tie into these path dependencies around urban sprawl and around high carbon intensity transportation. So I think those I'd like to make those 2 points. That first one around the how we meet those incremental costs, and the second one that tying together. This is going to be it's going to be impossible to usefully disaggregate adaptation from mitigation and sustainable development and urban development more broadly.
Thank you, David, for that. I have a question from a sort of personal experience, and it taps a bit onto what David said in his introduction about the sort of challenges for nature-based solutions, but also on what the other David Jackson said about that much of the initial funding for new types of solutions is gonna not be market based. I'm involved with a program called Build with Nature Asia, Building with Nature Indonesia, and as part of that program, the first project that was executed was in Demak on the northern coast of Java, where we reintroduced a mangrove belt to protect the villages there. And that project was funded partly by the Dutch government. We brought a lot of scientists on board, worked a lot with the community to help sort of rethink economic practices, because of course mangroves can be nurseries for fisheries and they can increase the productivity, etc. And these projects are really critical, right? We all know that nature-based solutions are parts of where we need to go. We need to scale them up quickly. We need to do a lot of them in order to deal with these combined crises, including the biodiversity crisis. But one of the things that I find really interesting about that experience is that after having done that project, the scientists started measuring, and they started to measure the sort of increased productivities. And the initial benefit cost analysis, which was about sort of 2, was after all this research was sort of readjusted and became 8. And so we realized from the increased productivity of the fisheries and the economy that this was a really good project. But most of the lessons learned were after the fact, because we were finally able to measure a project after the fact. And I see a lot of projects stalling simply because the data are not there. Are there ways, or have you seen ways where benefit cost analysis after the fact can be sort of become a platform for more finance, for replication, etc.? Or are we still dependent on grant funding to get these innovative projects off the ground and then hope for the best the next time? I see Tatiana sort of responding. Well, I gave this example.
I'm
so
looking.
Okay.
I'm looking. It's like, where do I raise my hand? And no, Mattis, is super interesting because, one of the things that we're doing in the team now is moving much, quite aggressively. The concepts of nature-based solutions, both within the cities and on the boundaries of the cities, because one of the big problems that we have still working in cities is that we tend to be, compounded by the administrative boundaries, and, treat most of the problems, of adaptation and resiliency without taking into consideration what is immediately adjacent. So in terms of reports, in terms of the value of biodiversity, especially in the area of contributions to economic gains and so on, I have to say that the WEF, the World Economic Forum, recently launched a report which has some valuation, which I think is very helpful. At the moment, just to give you a few more examples, we're working in the city of Barranquilla, doing the whole of the, if you want, restoration of the mangroves, which are critical because Barranquilla is at the exit of the River Magdalena. And we're recovering with Conservation International and with a few other, especially, the local city, but especially the communities. Several of the, they're called ciénagas, which is, several of the bay areas, which, are essential to the resiliency of the city. And that is being combined with, gray infrastructure, especially, in relationship to drainage, in heavy rain time. There is valuations that are, being done. And as you said, in general, the projections at this stage are lower than what is expected to be in the future. But I think what is really important, and we often forget, is that connection in between the rural and the urban context, and in between the communities that live on both sides, because the benefits, will accrue to both of them. And we tend to forget in our computations and in the way that, we treat these interventions, the holistic, territorial approach. I see that Sheila, it's also passionate about it.
I just want to give an interesting fact. During COVID, we suddenly realized that there were almost 200 million people who were circular migrants, who then had to move from urban areas back to rural areas. And we have this social security, what we call an employment guarantee scheme, which the government gives money to rural people for 100 days work. And it's supposed to be one of the largest social security things. So we did a sample survey, and we tried to we realized that that 30 to 50% of all the money that these migrants earn in cities goes to their rural kinship group. And no economist has calculated this. So it's pretty much like what's happening to the diaspora from India, China, and Philippines, where that money is more than the foreign direct investment that goes to these countries. So what you were saying about the urban and rural economy, these elements of informal transactions are just not calculated and their impact not understood in terms of the resilience building potential that informality in cities produces to rural areas. So I'm just saying that when you start unraveling these things, there's so many things that are there which are not factored, in this process. I hope this wasn't diverging you from what you were saying.
I don't think so. David Jackson, you want to follow up?
Well, just on the same topic, really, I mean, it's a really great question you raised, and there's, about how you factor in these things in a more systematic way so that you actually have a model of the way it works, and bringing in the features that Sheila's mentioning. I mean, there's an interesting analogy, which is what they're doing in some countries where they're trying to factor in the economic benefit of unpaid childcare. And so let's say you during your career, you take 2 or 3 breaks to look after kids, for example, or look after elderly relatives. Then your insurance contributions or your pension contributions, go to pieces. So you basically don't have a pension pot or something when you retire. But in some countries, they're trying to calculate so that actually that period when you are looking after relatives or looking after children, the state pays your pension contribution because you're actually doing an economic service. And so you actually have an unbroken pension contribution, and just to factor that in. So the numbers do add up. But of course, people don't want to admit that. They don't want to take that into account, because the state kind of gets a free ride on the fact that people, or the economy, in fact, gets a free ride on some of these services that are provided, for example, with unpaid childcare. But I think if we're going to be able to get the financing at scale for climate adaptation and avoid the huge disaster that awaits us, I mean, David, it's coming down the track unless we can do something about it. We need to really look at the whole architecture of the way these things are calculated. I mean, it's kind of a bit of an upscaling of the mangrove example you gave, Matthias, but we need to kind of find ways just to look again at the way things are being calculated, so that this investment in resilience in situ, investment in towns and cities, runoff, and control the surface of, changing the surface so that there's less runoff, and it might be more expensive, but you need this absorbent type of road surface. That's one of the incremental costs, but it's extremely expensive. So these are the kind of things we need to factor in. And I think the architecture, the financial architecture, is not there right now. And that's why I'm really passionate that we don't just, bankable projects are important, but that we don't just reduce it back to that, because it's a lot bigger than that. I think yeah, but thank you. I think it's a really good point you raise.
And including, I think, in those calculations, indeed, the lock-ins, the cost of lock-ins, the cost of externalities that we are putting up ourselves by not building the right infrastructure, right? Jeannie, you had a follow-up on this.
Well, I was really going to address this to David Dodman and how this data gets into knowledge through the assessment reports, the ARC reports. It's a long route to this, but I can't imagine that Goldman Sachs is going to do this kind of assessment. Someone else needs to be doing it. It needs to become common knowledge. So the question is, what's the pathway to getting this kind of calculation into the works?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what I'm doing here is sort of juggling one hat to another hat, to another one altogether, and putting on my objective scientific assessment hat as an IPCC author. I mean, the mechanism is that the IPCC has a specific mandate to provide assessments of the evidence on climate change impacts and responses in order to support the UNFCCC as the intergovernmental legal body that takes significant decisions on mitigation, adaptation, on financing. Where there is an interesting opening is that historically the IPCC has very strongly privileged the physical science, the meteorological science, and it's been a very long battle, which still not entirely won, but a very long battle to get the social sciences taken seriously in that assessment process. And then a battle within that has been to recognize that knowledge comes in multiple forms and not just peer-reviewed academic publications. And so there's a greater, there is the opportunity for examples from consultancy firms, from NGOs, from governments and intergovernmental bodies, for evidence generated through those agencies to be considered seriously. And I think that certainly there are quite a few of us in the IPCC who see our responsibility as going beyond, whilst still being taking the academic literature very seriously, going beyond it to look for where knowledge comes from. And also, and this is significant in the latest assessment, Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge beginning to be taken seriously in the IPCC process as well. I suppose the last comment I'd make is that the IPCC process is very strongly pushed to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And so the more we're able to assess evidence and say this has been demonstrated, the financial information, the returns of investment, the benefits to large number of people, as much as possible being able to demonstrate what has happened is a very good way of actually making policy recommendations without actually saying that they're recommendations, being able to make the statement that this has proven to be effective in these ways is the best way of the IPCC being able to make the case for future actions.
So do these recommendations hold water with people like Tatiana and Elizabeth in the investment sector?
I think you're asking them, not me. I mean,
yes, I am. Sorry, David.
No, absolutely. I think the recommendations. Again, we, for institutions like IADB, we do not. Once again, we don't define the national policy in each of the countries, but definitely, we can orient it and we can support it and we can provide, knowledge that builds, the national decisions or subnational decisions. And I have to say that, from our side, obviously, the IPCC documents are central to the way we try to orient decision making and design projects as well. So
what I was getting at was how do we get knowledge and experience into the decision making process is really what I was saying.
Well, Jeannie, as you already know, in fact, we have some specific work oriented towards number one, conducting research which is relevant and directly related to the concerns that our clients, secondly, in the way we design projects, these are shaped obviously by multiple stakeholders, and we have spoken about many today, but also by evidence which is available in the public domain. And thirdly, we have a robust process which all DFIs have, which is based on OECD guidelines on impact evaluation and actual completion and intermediate reviews, which actually are able to reorient actions which might be necessary under a particular investment or a policy intervention. Sorry, I hope that answered the question, but I'm not sure.
Liz?
I mean, I think I was going to say as well, I feel like Jeannie, you probably could teach us the lessons on this, but I think that that's really the key thing that we've been trying to work on as well, both through what our investment in 100 Resilient Cities, where we were really trying to help local governments understand, quantify, really wrestle with that knowledge, which I feel like, David, when I was thinking about what you were saying, is just, how do you, and Sheila too, like how do you, getting some sort of quantification and data and knowledge around the flows of resources, I think would really be helpful in articulating and giving government and policymakers an understanding of where of what the value lost or avoided loss would be, and perhaps help them make a more compelling argument to mobilize resources to this. I appreciate, David, your point that not all of these projects are going to be bankable in the traditional sense. I also do feel like and maybe it's just my reflection on some of the work that we've been doing in New York City with the Lower Manhattan Climate Change Coalition, but just in order to get some of these large scale infrastructure projects done will require significant capital mobilization, and it seems like, we've got to get the private sector moving because they've made so many net zero commitments. And it just feels like we've got to find a way to get them into this market in a more robust way. I think the other thing I would just offer up, just two more things, if I could, I think regulation is also something that we can help advocate for, and we haven't really talked about it too much here, but that seems to move things. And I don't want to bring this up, but I feel like we're seeing how economic incentives can change behavior in a good way. And so I think that that's something that we've certainly thought about, in terms of mobilizing philanthropic capital. I think one of the things that we've also been advocating for is an ability to actually have philanthropy, have climate count as a philanthropic use of capital, which currently under US law, it does not. So there are key things that we can do really easy to try to get things moving in a good and robust way.
Thank you for all three of you for reflecting on this topic. Thank you all for giving us a glimmer of hope. Thank you also for the great questions, David Jackson, Jeannie Burge and Sheila Patel. I think it's time for lunch or dinner, or maybe some other thing wherever you are. I enjoyed this very much, and I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you very much.